Welcome again, everyone. My name is Brian Balicki, your host of the podcast, The Juice is Worth the Squeeze, Embrace It. It's my life story of 56 years as a type 1 diabetic and still counting. This is part 2 of the episode, which I call How Different I Am. This is the last episode before I begin to take a much deeper dive into my life story in the next podcast. My last episode discussed some history about diabetes and its consequences over the last 15 years and how I was affected. In a nutshell, the basic takeaway from that discussion was, other than the day I was admitted and diagnosed in 1968 as a type 1 diabetic, I've never been hospitalized with the underlying condition of diabetes. The podcast reviewed research on trends in hospitalizations between 2010 and 2019 for diabetes-related conditions, the most important and consequential of these being retinopathy, neuropathy, kidney disease, and lower leg amputations. During that time, more than 45 million hospitalizations occurred for these and related complications of diabetes. The average number of diabetics living in the U.S. during that period was between 25 and 30 million type 1s. I did not experience any of the events that I talked about during that last decade. Yet doing some quick math, the data suggested I was at pretty high risk for experiencing at least one such episode over the decade as I aged. As it turned out, I never did. Oh, and by the way, I didn't mention I survived the recent pandemic with only a brief brush with COVID-19, all treated at home. Yes, there have been other hospitalizations in my lifetime, which I will discuss in later podcasts, things like food poisoning in college, major orthodontia work requiring a hospitalization to extract 8 teeth in my late 20s prior to marriage. But to this day, very little medical drama has happened. I'm actually a pretty lucky and healthy guy, knocking on wood here. So let me continue with a few other points that explain why I believe my 56-plus year journey is remarkable. Recently, I came across a 2010 study published in a trade journal with the name Diabetes. In it, several type 1s were recognized as what they called ultimate diabetes survivors. Their term, not mine. I understand that this medical and public education exercise is an annual thing with the Joslin Diabetes Center in Boston. Why were they acknowledged? They were living with type 1 diabetes for 50 years. Me? I've never been nominated, selected for this or any other such award related to diabetes at least, nor have I ever felt as a type 1 diabetic like I'm surviving anything. I'm blessed to be living a full age at age 71. So my point here is that if awards were given out to type 1s who have lived with and or managed their conditions for shorter periods than I, 50 years to be exact, my journey and my story may also be noteworthy. I'm in the middle of my 56th year. No awards yet, just glad to be alive, well, and actually able to talk about it in podcasts like this. Third, I truly consider my type 1 experience to be noteworthy because none of my immediate ancestors on both sides of my family or progeny, my children, grandchildren, etc., had or has lived with type 1 diabetes. Again, knocking on wood here. There were no warning signs or game plans, for that matter, to deal with type 1 diabetes before or after I was diagnosed in 1968. There was no manual titled Diabetes for Dummies then. Nothing back then existed to project what I should expect over a 55-year journey with type 1 diabetes. Fourth, my story is different because the origins of my type 1 diabetes are noteworthy. An explanation has been given to me and my family over the years that my condition was what they call autoimmune in origin, meaning it had little or nothing to do with events around me or personal circumstances. The latest research suggests my own internal immune system in 1968 simply began attacking my own pancreatic cells and they stopped working. Why? No one has been able to explain that very convincingly to me to this day. They say I may have been the victim of a genetic, random, metabolic anomaly with a 1 in 70 trillion chance of happening. Pretty slim odds, don't you think? By the way, that probability comes from research that illustrates how unique each human set of DNA chromosome is. Shout out to my mom and dad here. However, there is another element I believe impacted when I was first diagnosed with type 1. In the summer of 1968, I was also a victim of gang violence on the streets of Chicago. No guns, thankfully, just a single physical violent beating. Within 3 months of that event, I developed all the symptoms of type 1. I was completely caught off guard during this time because no one in my family had ever been through such a major physical transformation before. I call it a life-quake event. I devote one chapter in my book to this incident, and it will be the focus of my next podcast. Fifth, I've lived with and or managed my diabetes over the years with every imaginable therapy ever deployed within medicine. I have some personal experiences, lessons learned, and thoughts about the medical breakthroughs from each of these experiences and how they impacted, good and bad, my ability to manage my blood sugars over a half century. I have something to say about the myriad therapies. Yes, the glass syringes, the metal needles, plastic disposables, the finger sticking, insulin pumps, continuous glucose monitoring systems, and the possibilities and opportunities of self-management. I've used all these things, sometimes in public spaces, even overseas, but mostly at home. Finally, clearly, type 1 diabetes has impacted my life tremendously, surprisingly positively, though. I can share with listeners I've been lucky to enjoy certain special events, what I call Kodak moments, through my 55-plus years in my private, non-professional life. These events depended in part on and challenged my physical abilities and dexterities, like my eyesight, my endurance, my ambulatory health, and my general diabetic control to fully experience them all. Collectively, I refer to them as the juice. I will dive deeper into these this concept in different upcoming podcasts and a soon-to-be published book. So a question I've had recently as my lifelong journey has continued, what role have I played in living this journey or this dream? Have I influenced the events? Pretty difficult question, since I did not keep a personal diary about this over the decades. Even though, here's some of the thoughts I have had. Managing type 1 diabetes for 55 years, clearly, I've been aided by many medical and scientific breakthroughs, not to mention the extraordinary help from my own medical team over time. During this same time, many but not all type 1 diabetics have also been helped with these same technologies, medical professionals, and caring. But in deciding about doing these podcasts and writing an upcoming book, I asked myself the question, what have I myself done, putting aside these breakthroughs, to successfully manage type 1 diabetes for 56 years? If I can't address this one issue for my listeners and readers, would these podcasts really be as helpful or as valuable as I believe and hope they can be? So here's a quick summary of my thinking. To be clear, I promise I'll dive deeper into this part of my life story in future podcasts, but here's a picture of what the available data suggests. It begins with some thoughts about life expectancy for me back in 1968 and how it might differ today if I were diagnosed as type 1 and be 15 years old. You're looking at a graph which has 3 columns. The leftmost column displays the life expectancy for an average 15-year-old teenager in 1968 and in 2022. Life expectancy was 81 years in 1968, while in 2022 it dropped to 78 years. You can form your own conclusions about that. The column to the right in the middle shows the estimated years in a lifetime that might be lost due to type 1 diabetes. 35 years in 1968, 23 years in 2022. The shift between the two data points, I believe, can be explained collectively by advances in science, treatment, technology, and public awareness and health education generally. These advances led to a 12-year improvement in an expected lifetime for type 1 diabetics. The next graphic highlights how and when these advances in type 1 science played out between 1960 and the present. From a big picture perspective, real improvements in the science began with the introduction of dynamic insulin medication therapy and pump technology in the 1980s and 90s, followed in the early 2000s with the introduction of real-time measurement of blood sugars, and soon thereafter with continuous glucose monitoring. The drop in the blue line in the graph indicates that fewer years of life were lost among diabetics as these advances were rolled out across the country and across the globe. What intrigued me personally about the graph were 2 points in time, 1968 and 2022. In the next graph, you'll see that there are 2 years, these 2 years are highlighted. In 1968, the year I was diagnosed with type 1, I was expected to lose 35 years in the normal lifespan of a 15-year-old teenager. While I might have expected a lifetime to 81 years old in 1968, being type 1, that lifespan would probably be reduced to 46 years. In 2022, if I turned 15 in that year and was also diagnosed as type 1 diabetic then, I would lose fewer years, 20 to 23 years to be exact. This shift or reduction in lifetime years lost presumably represents the difference that medical advances and technology have made in the lives of type 1s between those 2 years. Seems to make sense. They've added, on average, 12 to 13 years of life to type 1s like me. So for me, the key point here is if I'm now 71 years of age, have lived past age 46, and benefited from medical advances that led to 12 more years of life, that would take me to age 58. What explains the additional 13 years of life that I've been lucky to have since my 58th birthday? The next graphic, the pie chart, suggests the possibility that these 13 years may be my contribution to my current lifespan at age 71. Personal behavior, lifestyle, choices, and everyday commitment to managing my type 1 diabetes. I believe my own 10 priorities for lifetime management of type 1 diabetes might explain this difference. The next graphic beyond the pie chart tries to lay out a sequential path to explain this a little bit further. The two graphs collectively combined suggest my own actions as a type 1 may have added 13 years to my lifespan, and the meter is still running. This is a big part of the juice that results from following the 10 lifetime priorities I will discuss more fully later. This is the value I hope I can bring to the discussion about how to reasonably manage type 1 diabetes over 55 years and enjoy a healthy lifestyle later in senior years and retirement. I trust you can see why my life story may be a bit different from other type 1s, type 2s, and even pre-diabetics living and growing up with a disease. From personal experience over 55 plus years, you can have the lifetime you choose as a type 1 diabetic, but making healthy and responsible choices along the way is essential. Easy to say, difficult to do, right? I say embrace it. Manage the details of treatment and personal behavior as best as you can every day. But don't stress if you don't quite meet them. Don't get overly frustrated or angry with yourself. I've learned blood sugars can spike simply because of stress itself. Type 1 diabetics need to be mindful of this. Living with type 1 can be an enjoyable journey, and there's little need to sprint. If you commit to taking care of yourself every day, and even if you are not as successful as you want to, you will still receive what I call quality of life points later on. Yes, days, months, even years of life itself. Even if you don't perfectly meet everyday challenges, you will get closer to a landing spot of blood sugar control that should provide a fuller quality of life during your senior years. So that's all for today's podcast. I look forward to joining you in my next podcast. It begins with some pretty dramatic events that occurred almost 56 years ago in the summer of 1968. My next episode, number 4, I talk about a Hollywood-like movie drama that began my life as a Type 1, what I called The Ambush, a gang violence incident back in 1968 that changed my life forever. I hope you'll tune in with me for that episode. Finally, as I discussed earlier, if you have any comments, questions, or other feedback you'd like to share about this podcast, I definitely welcome it. Please visit my podcast survey at fanlist.com/the juice. I repeat, fanlist.com/the juice. Thank you for your time. Signing off for now. Cheerfully, Brian Balicki. Have a great day.